record. Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we are going to be taking a look at America at the end of the 19th and earliest 20th century and the idea of America expanding and American imperialism. So, a lot to cover. Let's get started. The farming life is never an easy life. But following this American Civil War, farmers really did experience a boom in sales. And that was because of a lot of different reasons. We see new tech shows up, new application shows up, new freedom for labor shows up. And that continued to go on for about the next couple decades until the early 1890s, when a series of really bad drought years sets in and farmers are just unable to cope with this. Now, if it was just bad drought, that would be one thing. I mean, when your harvest is light, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. But at the same time, the foreign market for all the foods and goods that Americans are producing had slowly been transforming for the past couple of years and had started to replace the United States as their go-to place. For example, England starts getting their cotton from Egypt and India and no longer buys from the United States at all. And if you could buy from Eurasia while living in Eurasia, your biggest cost transporting goods across the Atlantic was gone. There was no reason to spend money extra for transporting something you could get the same or better quality. So for farmers in the United States during this time, this was a real double whammy. Your goods are less valuable, and at the same time, you can't sell them. In reaction to this, farmers started to demand a bigger, more powerful political voice. And this gave rise to the Grange movement, also referred to as the patrons of husbandry, also referred to as the Populist Party. And they called for a national farm organization, the idea that all farmers across the country needed to work together to build something new. They believed that there was too much power in the hands of the government. They believed that the price of railroads and railroad shipping had negatively impacted their ability to bring stuff to market. They wanted more printing of paper currency, of greenbacks, and they start working together and forming these co-ops, these cooperative ventures, where all farmers in a region start working together, start pooling their resources, start making themselves all part of one collective unit. In the cities, in industry, this would be what we would call a union. The difference is we're looking at a smaller number of people covering a much larger geographic area. And the continued movement of the Grange movement would lead to the alliances. And these were kind of organization of farmer clubs. And the first of these wound up in Texas, in Lampasas County in 1877. The farming clubs would grow very, very quickly and start incorporating more cotton producing areas until there was again more power that they could collectively bargain with. If all people who produce cotton are all saying the rates are too expensive, you might be more inclined to listen to them instead of a couple of individual farmers. The alliances really did stress the idea of cooperation. They understood that the collective farming group was all together or all going to fall apart. As co-ops, they could buy things, supplies, machines, seeds, horses, plows, you name it, at cost, and then effectively make a lot more money because they don't have to spend as much on that initial investment. And they are seen, these farmers, these farmer alliances are seen by some on the outside as dangerous radicals. They're all banding together. They're all working together for some communal goal. This sounds like socialism. This might even be communism. Ah, I digress. Because the Democrats and the Republicans both really don't make clear concessions towards the farming alliances, the farmers create a third party, and this is the Populist Party. And this group was really instrumental in fighting for the farmers. Now, third party groups, yeah, when you think back on history, third parties never really managed to clinch the big elections, but the Populist Party was always based on small scale, grassroots, homegrown local problems. And they do have a lot of big successes at the city, county, and state levels. While the Populist Party is growing, they also fought for some of the same things that people in the cities are fighting for. 8-hour work days. They wanted to end immigration from undesirable nations that at this time in the late 19th century would reference South and East Europe. Each side of this workers group, the farmers with the Populist Party and the unions, are trying to balance the same thing. They're trying to wrest more power from the state. And sometimes they're more successful, sometimes they're less successful. One thing we see with unions is the ability to argue, the ability to strike. And at this time in 1894, Pullman's train company, well, the workers go on strike. And this was a really wild time because the protesters lived in the communal town of Pullman. Pullman, if you worked for the Pullman company, you had to live in their work town, and your rent came right out of your salary. So it was a lot of cash that's taken from you to live where they say you have to. And Pullman is one of the bigger names in train works. So there's a lot of gripe when wages are cut, when rent goes up. And as people start bringing these grievances to their union leader, a guy named Eugene Debs, it's decided that a strike is going to happen. And this isn't just the Pullman company that's striking, it's the American Railway Union that goes on strike. What this means is no train would hook up to Pullman cars. You can have a train ready to go, but if any car along that train said Pullman on it, the union workers aren't going to hook it up. They're not going to drive it. They're not going to ship stuff on it. And Pullman was one of the higher end train companies. It would be like if I gave you the keys to a brand new luxury car, but I didn't give you any tires and no one else sells you tires. Yes, you've got this great thing, but you're not going to make any money on it. And it ultimately, the strike ends because of a group of railroad owners go to the president and they convince Cleveland that the mail wasn't going to go through. And without that, communications across the nation would collapse. Cleveland agrees, this is terrible, this is horrible. He sends in the soldiers to break up the strike. Debs is given an injunction saying this strike is over, go home. He says no way. He goes to prison for a while for it, and then the strike is broken. Debs, while he's in prison, he joins the Socialist Party, and he will then go on to run for president a couple of times. And some of his later attempts for presidency under the socialist banner, he'll get millions of people voting for him. So this wasn't just a small group of factory workers or train workers that were affecting. This is having larger and larger impacts in America's political and social balance. When we look back at the history of money in this country, the United States has typically been a bimetallic standard, which means that a dollar was backed by gold and silver. You could trade your greenbacks for gold or silver. And that had historically been the case, but over the course of the 19th century, gold and silver both start losing money a lot really quickly. The gold rush of 1849 in California dropped it a lot. The discovery of gold in Sioux Falls, the discovery of gold in the Colorado River, the Comstock lode in Nevada, all worked to bring the price of precious metals down more and more and more. And this leads to a level of inflation that the United States had never seen before. And as the 1890s are about halfway through 1893, we see that the inflation in the United States is made much worse with the collapse of the London banking house Baring Brothers. Baring Brothers, well, you can see in this political cartoon, and this is called The English Octopus. It feeds on nothing but gold. Baring Brothers had a hand in industry, in economics, in farming, in everything. And their tentacles stretched around the world. Loans, lines of credit, mortgages, international shipping. Baring Brothers had a role in a lot of this. Now, they were not controlling any one of those industries I mentioned, but they were sufficient in all of them that when this banking house collapses and starts calling in all debts from all persons, it leads to a global depression. Factor that in with the level of inflation the United States has, and we see a really disastrous problem. This was the worst economic depression the United States had ever seen. And people are unemployed. They go through the streets of Washington, D.C., looking for any kind of relief that they possibly can. And throughout 1894, the Treasury's supply of gold really starts to dwindle to the point of having no cash on hand and no gold to back the dollar with. And it's not until 1895 does the banker J.P. Morgan, as well as a number of other bankers, basically bail out the United States. They buy $62 million in bond with the agreement that half of what that money is going to be in gold, those coming from Europe. These guys gave that much cash to the United States. And today you can buy bonds, you can buy treasury notes and T-bills and all that stuff. And over time, those things increase in value. The fact that Morgan buys this much, and with half of it being in precious metals, means his investment of $62 million ultimately netted him well over $200 million, was this great wow moment. And yeah, there's reasons why would JP Morgan do this? You could argue he wanted to save the nation. You could argue that he wanted to make money for himself. And here's the crazy thing, both would, kind of be true. In 1896, it's time for a presidential election, and boy howdy, it is a real noodle scratcher on this one. The Republicans are going to back William Jennings Bryan, and the Democrats are going to back William McKinley. And these guys are, aside from the first difference being party difference. The second difference is over money, whether it should be gold, whether it should be silver, whether it was going to be paper money, whether it was time to think of something else. And at the onset of this, the two candidates really did seem pretty well. The Republicans definitely had a lead, to say the least. I mean, whenever there's a depression, there's always favoritism towards the other party. So the fact that Cleveland was a Democrat, and Brian is running on the Democratic ticket, people aren't likely to vote for that party again. And the Republicans seemed to nail this one. McKinley was a former war hero, and the thing that tipped the scales was not either one of these guys or their background, but it was the ideas of how they were going to gain power. And William Jennings Bryan uses this speech, this public speech known as a Cross of Gold speech, and he talks about the horrors of gold and how gold was going to destroy us all. He goes after the titans of industry, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and this looks like he's really gunning for everything he can. He's young, he's ambitious, people are starting to notice him. But if you know your history, you know we never had a president named Bryan. We had a president named McKinley, though. McKinley wins because McKinley is able to outspend Bryan, including, but not limited to, raising millions of dollars to persuade people to vote for him. And this was used in a lot of ways. And $3.5 million now, yeah, that's not necessarily enough to run on a presidential campaign. I mean, today in the 21st century, you would expect someone to throw $1 billion into an election, not a couple of $1 million. But in 1896, this was enough money, first off, to hire 1,500 speakers who went around the nation and spoke for William McKinley to get him elected. It was enough to create 250 million pieces of campaign literature, posters, buttons, tokens, dolls, you name it. Anything that had McKinley's name on it was being printed. And there's not 250 million Americans alive during this time. So the idea of how much is spent to get McKinley elected is really unprecedented. We had never seen this kind of spending done before. One of the biggest theatrical things that happened was McKinley had these front porch conversations where people could queue up at his home, go talk to the man for 1 minute, and bring any question they wanted to ask him, or anything they wanted to address, or anything they want to make sure he knows about. And then he would talk about that with anyone who showed up. And if you're the average person, this is really remarkable. Wow, the chance to really sit down with a top running presidential candidate and have a conversation with them. If you are on the fence, this might be the thing to throw you over it. In reality, these were highly scripted events. The people who were called up, they would talk about a subject, and then McKinley had a very well-written response ready to go. So no matter what the question was, McKinley was always able to tackle it, which would ultimately lead to his election to the role of president. All right. Today we talked about the expanse ideas of the United States. We talked about the rise of the populist movement. We talked about the Pullman work. We talked about the economic collapse that took place at the end of the 19th century. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.